Today's topic for English language arts and reading is going to be on story sequencing. We're continuing our unit on reading comprehension, or trying to increase our understanding of passages and stories that we read. And so story sequencing is pretty straightforward. We've actually done this before. When you follow directions, you follow a sequence, right? Sometimes you have to do things in a certain order. And so story sequencing is pretty similar. Story sequencing talks about the order in which events occur in a story, okay? So let's talk about story sequencing and why it's important for us to know in order to increase our reading comprehension. All right, well, what is story sequencing? A story sequence refers to the linear order in which the story's events occur. We're using words like first, then, next, last, etc. We use story sequencing to both recall information from a story and to retell a story to others. Most stories have, at the very least, a distinctive beginning, middle, and end. So even if you were telling someone about washing your pet dog, right? I'm looking at the little image to the bottom, or to the left rather. If you're telling them the story of washing your pet dog, you're going to have the beginning, which is, well, why did you wash your dog? Because he's dirty. So first, my dog was really dirty. Then I got a bathtub and I filled it with water and soaped him up and got him all clean. Afterwards, I dried him off and he was so much happier, okay? So even in that short story that I just retold you about maybe my day's events, there was a beginning, middle, and end. And I used words like first, next, last, or finally to indicate that the flow of events in the story had a beginning, middle, and end, okay? And so I say linear order because for the most part, a lot of stories that we read happen that way. Linear order just means one after the other. So the events occur, start at the beginning, you go to the middle, you go to the end. There are stories that kind of, they play with time a little more, and so they'll kind of, go back and forth between the beginning and the end, but that's not really something that we're going to discuss today. Just know that most stories have a beginning, middle, and end, and it's important for us to know what the sequence or the order is in which those events happen so that we can recall information to answer questions and also retell a story, to some of our friends or family. All right. You guys should be super familiar with this because we just went over it in our story elements presentation. So plot. Plot is what happens in the story. The plot includes the problem, the main issue, the key details, which are the important events in the story that outline how characters grow and change, as well as the solution, how the problem is solved. And that's usually at the end of the story, okay? So plot is super integral to understanding story sequence because you need to know the key events, the key details, all right, as well as the problem and solution, which comes at the end. So some common sequencing words when you are reading a story's plot and you are trying to figure out, okay, what happens first, then second, third, last, etc. These are words that I'll tell you, okay? So for the beginning of the story, some sequencing words that you might hear that tell you, oh, this happens first is, well, the word first, today, to begin with, once upon a time, or to start. Those all tell me, boom, that goes in the beginning of a story. For the middle of a story, we might hear some common sequencing words like next, second, third, then, after, soon, meanwhile, in addition, or subsequently. Those tell you that events have shifted and now we are no longer in the beginning of the story. We're in the middle. We're in the plot. We're trying to figure out what's going on. Maybe they've introduced the problem. Maybe they are just telling you some important events that are occurring that are helping the characters grow and change. So be mindful of those words that indicate this is the middle of the story. And then for the ending, the last part of the story, these are words that you'll read and you'll know, okay, the end is happening soon. I need to pay attention so that I know what what the solution is, right? So words like finally, at the end, after all, lastly, eventually, or in conclusion. Not all stories are going to use these common sequencing words, but most of them will at least incorporate one or two, and that'll help you to take apart the story, separate it into its components, beginning, middle, and end, and figure out what is going on, okay? How can I retell this story? How can I recall key events so that I can answer questions? All right. Story sequencing is an important aspect of reading comprehension. It's actually not unlike following directions in a recipe, which I mentioned earlier at the beginning of the lesson. When you sequence a story, you recall the main events that have occurred in their exact order from beginning to end. So just like reading a story, you want to know what happens in the beginning and middle and end. The same thing with following directions for a recipe, right? Can you skip the beginning and middle and go straight to the end product? Chances are no, unless it's like a pre-made thing. And even then, you still have to microwave it for a certain amount of time or cook it in some way, shape, or form in order for it to be edible. All right, so it's important to know all components of the story, the beginning, middle, and end. If you only remember the beginning or only remember the end, you're missing a lot of core information that will tell you about the characters and the theme or the main message of the story. So we want to be able to recall the events accurately and sequence them or put them in their correct order. So let's look at this example. My class went to the pumpkin patch. When we got there, we took a hayride to get out to the pumpkins. We each picked one pumpkin to take home. My pumpkin was heavy, so I put it in a wagon to carry back. So if I have this story and these pictures to my right represent components of the story, how would I sequence it? What would I start with? Well, let's go to the very first part of the story. My class went to the pumpkin patch. When we got there, we took a hayride out to get the pumpkins. Ooh, hayride. Only one of these pictures looks like it's taking place in a tractor with hay. So I know that this picture goes first. We each picked one pumpkin to take home. My pumpkin was heavy, so I put it in a wagon to carry back. All right, well, if that's the very end of the story, the wagon, I can put that for number 3, the end. And so that tells me, oh, the pumpkin goes in the middle. So you can also use the process of elimination to help you sequence a story. If you know the beginning and you know the middle, then chances are, if you know the beginning and the end, it will help you figure out what happens in the middle. And that's for simple examples like these. When we're reading actual stories and passages, it's a little more challenging to sequence events because you really need to know the finer details of what's going on. All right, this is our last example. Mia is making applesauce. First, she peeled all the apples she had. Next, she cut the apples into small slices. Last, Mia put her apples in a pot of hot water to cook. When the apples became soft, Mia stirred them together to make applesauce. I like this story because it has some common sequencing words, all right? Words like first. First, she peeled all the apples she had. So we're gonna find the picture that looks like she's peeling, and it happens to be picture number 2. So I'm gonna move that to spot 1. Next, she cut the apples into small slices. So which of the 2 remaining pictures looks like she's cutting it into small slices? You're right, the one on the top does. So it's gonna go for 2, the middle of the story. And last, Mia put her apples in a pot of hot water to cook. Well, you only have 1 picture remaining, and it happens to be of her putting apples in a pot and cooking over a stove. So this picture is gonna go for number 3, the last part of my story. And so that is the correct sequence, okay? So as you'll see, some stories have nice common sequencing words that help us figure out beginning, middle, end, and some stories don't, and we just kind of have to infer or recall the information as we're reading it, okay? So just be careful and be mindful when you're reading, and I will see you guys in class later today.